Welcome to Listen In, a podcast series designed to help parents and caregivers support their child's emotional well-being. Brought to you by the Ad Council's Sound It Out campaign with Pivotal. Let's dive in. I'm Dr. Buqué, and today I'm joined by Dr. Regina Miranda. Dr. Miranda joins us not only as a field expert, but also as a parent herself. And I'm so grateful that you're joining us. So, Dr. Miranda, could you please tell us a little bit about your area of expertise and what you focus on?
Well, Dr. Buqué, thank you for having me, and I'm excited about this conversation with you. I study why young people think about suicide, what are the circumstances or the ways of thinking that lead them to think about taking their lives, what it is that they're thinking about, and how that can inform assessment of risk, for determining or trying to predict who might be at risk of attempting suicide and who might do so sooner or when they might do so.
Really important work and critical work for any of us that are, like myself, clinicians, right, researchers, for community members, and also for parents and caregivers, and maybe even for adolescents themselves to really kind of have an understanding, right, around what are these, critical factors. So I thank you for your work, and I know we'll touch on that a bit. However, I did have some questions for you about a really important aspect of parenting that basically every parent will have to go through, which is transitions. Parents go through transitions at so many different stages in their parenting process. And some of them they expect, some of them perhaps not. Some feel like they're not as prepared for. And quite frankly, maybe even their kids aren't necessarily prepared for them, right? Because, like, for example, puberty just kind of surfaces when it surfaces and everybody just kind of has to adjust. So can we start there? Can we start with what can you tell us about that transition period, whichever it may be, whether it's puberty or going into college or maybe even transitions that are unplanned, like going to a new city, right? And living in a new city. What can you tell us about those transitions and how they impact the parent-child relationship?
Yeah, well, kids go through a lot of transitions, and we go through a lot of transitions as parents. There's no perfect way to parent, and so we're all just learning. Experts can come in and tell us what they think is the right way to do things, and I know that I've found out as someone who's in this field that I have often, quote unquote, failed at every single transition to do the thing that you are supposed to do. So first I wanted to start by saying that, have grace we should have grace towards ourselves as parents, because there's not a formula that is going to determine a particular outcome. And we're all just doing the best that we can. The first transition that we see is from, when kids are really little, when they're babies and they're very dependent on us, to when they start start talking, being talkative. They're in elementary school, and starting to express what they feel. And initially, we help them label those feelings. And so a part of that early stage of development is and helping them to label what's going on internally and what's happening in their emotional lives, and to recognize all sorts of different types of feelings, from being sad to being afraid to being really happy and joyful. And then as the transition happens from elementary school to middle school, we start seeing a lot of big changes. Kids go from kind of being more centered around us as parents. And, a good example that I think of is when my kids were really little. They got so excited when I would go to school. I remember my daughter once saying, "Oh my gosh, I got to see my mom 3 times today," because I was volunteering at her school for something. And she got so excited that she got to see me, because usually I'm at work. In middle school and later high school, when they don't come to school, okay, or they don't want you to hold their hand anymore when you're taking them to school, because they're becoming more independent. They are becoming more oriented towards their peers. They start developing friendships. And so you're not the main person who they look to for answers to questions or for conversation or for support. They have other people in their lives, and they're navigating new relationships. And especially when they're transitioning into puberty, There are a lot of physical changes. They're growing taller. They're developing different parts of their bodies. They're trying to figure out, what does this mean? At one point, I remember my daughter asking me to go buy her the American Girl doll, a book about her body, because going through changes through puberty. And I'm sure you remember that age. I remember that age. It can be a very awkward age, middle school. And so there's just a lot of changes that kids are navigating physically. It's also the brain is developing, and so their ability to regulate their emotions is also developing. That actually develops through, I think, age 29. And so we're at age, you and I have already completed our process of our brains have developed, our executive functioning abilities have developed, but the kids' ability to plan and regulate their feelings is still developing. And so they're going through a lot of transitions, also a transition from elementary to middle school. It's a lot of newer academic challenges, especially in a city like New York, where you're not necessarily going to the neighborhood school that all the kids go to. The kids are applying to different schools, and applying to high schools in New York City is like applying to college. So they're navigating a lot of transitions, and so these are a lot of different changes that kids are going through at this age, and it's important to give them a place where they can have conversations with us about what that is like. And some of that might be us reminiscing on what it was like for us and modeling for them what it's like to talk about what's going on in our lives, so that can be an example for them.
I love that, reminiscing and modeling, because it really helps them to see that a transition doesn't necessarily mean, that everything's going to fall apart. Because even as we know, transitions can be positive transitions, right? And so I'm glad that you're, kind of like referencing that. And I'm also curious, as to what kinds of emotions might surface for a child that's going through a transition, let's say like what I just mentioned, right? A transition that can be seen kind of as positive, but can still have some of that stress kind of embedded in there.
It depends on the child. So some kids might welcome the change. Maybe they didn't like their elementary school or their middle school, and they're excited about going to a larger high school, or maybe they are going to a smaller one and they're really happy about that and they welcome the change. Other kids might be afraid. Maybe their friends are going to a different school and they're going to miss their friends. Maybe some kids might be bullied, or might be afraid of bullying or have experienced bullying, and so they're navigating those experiences. And so I think it can really span a range of different types of feelings depending on past experiences that they've had, or what they might be anticipating. Some kids are in the moment and they don't really think about the future as much. Some kids are planners, and maybe they might start worrying about what might happen.
So if there are as many outcomes and perhaps emotions as there are children in these kinds of changes and circumstances, what can parents do to tune in to their specific child to understand how they are experiencing that transition?
Well, keep conversations open. First look for changes in our kids. But really starting as early as when they're very little, when you're talking about what's going on, what you're feeling, and encouraging them to talk about even simple things. So, for example, some parents may find it harder to have these conversations with their kids, but it can be as simple as talking about a TV show that they like and what's going on in the TV show, or music that they might like listening to and what it makes them feel like to listen to a particular song, and whether that reflects what they might be feeling. The Ad Council has this Sound It Out campaign, which uses music to help caregivers and kids talk about their feelings. And so they've put out a number of resources on their website, including a conversation starter pack that is a game that parents can use if they're having trouble starting those conversations or opening those conversations. to help parents reflect on their own experiences to also help their kids reflect on their experiences. So you can use a resource like that to start the conversation, or just leave the conversation open, or open the conversation by saying, this reminds me of when I went to sixth grade and I started this new school, and the teacher was giving me a tour, and I felt so awkward, and I didn't know anybody, and I didn't know if I was going to make any friends, and I wonder what's it like for you? Is it have you ever had thoughts like that, or do you ever have you been thinking about what it's going to be like to start sixth grade? It might be completely different for you, but that's what it was like for me. But to open up that conversation by reflecting on our own experiences first, to serve as an example, and then maybe using something that they're listening to or that they're watching on TV to start the conversation, or not even to start the conversation about feelings, to just have a conversation about whatever's going on that might not have to do with feelings, but to keep that conversation open, so that if you start with something small, that might open up conversations to bigger things.
Now, I love that you mentioned this because there is a bit of opening up that the parent has to do as well. And as you and I both know, the reality is that our generation and generations past weren't really taught to talk about their emotions, right? So that can be a little bit tricky for some parents. So is there anything that parents can actually do prior to actually approaching their children to understand their own emotions better?
There are a lot of different things. For me personally, it was therapy. So therapy has been a place where I've been able to kind of reflect back on my past experiences and how they impact my relationships now and my emotional life now. So that's helpful. Also, seeking support, right? Talking to other people who might support us, or it can be other parents who might be going through similar things. So, for example, my daughter just started college, and so there was a group of parents that we've known each other since elementary school, and our kids were not in the same high schools, but we would kind of give each other support, kind of moral support, as we navigated the college admissions process and our kids going away. So finding our own sources of support, and also using other resources to kind of reflect on how our own experiences might impact how we parent our kids. So I know that I come from, my parents are Honduran immigrants, and so a lot of how I grew up, it was about advancement, right? I came from a working class family, and so there was a lot of striving to advance academically. But my kids are in a different situation, right? I was born here in the United States, and they were born in the United States. So for them, I still had that mentality that I was very driven to achieve, because this was a way to advance financially so that we wouldn't be struggling. But for them, that wasn't, I was kind of imposing that framework onto my kids. And like, well, why isn't she more motivated? Why isn't she more motivated to, as motivated as I was to, doesn't she care about, getting good grades in school or thing? I mean, she does. My daughter's a good student, but I realized that for me, it was a driving factor, because it was more about, it was a survival mentality, right? Like, this was how you survive, right, by advancing. And she had a different home environment. She didn't have my same home environment. So for her, it was more like, yeah, it was a part of, she wants to do well, but it wasn't a matter of survival for her in the way that it felt for me, because of kind of coming from parents who were immigrants and worked really hard and struggled, and other complicated family dynamics. And so realizing that they're different people, and just because they're not as, maybe it's actually better, maybe it's a little healthier not to be so for them not to be so like achievement motivated in the way that I was, because that means they're not necessarily in survival mode, like I was.
Yeah. And it almost kind of, I think that one of the things that tends to happen along the parenting journey is that with certain milestones, parents have not been really oriented around taking a pause and realizing the micro victories. Like the fact that you were able to break the cycle of survival strategies and really kind of weren't necessarily imposing that into your children and the next generation, or even if you weren't doing it explicitly, but you just by way of what you provided them and how you parented them, they didn't feel that sense of urgency that survival leaves you with. That's a victory,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
And
I love that, and I love that your reference. Yeah, that's very in line with the work that you do to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma, and I love that idea of the micro victory. Absolutely. And so, yeah, there was a point with, especially my daughter, because she was the firstborn. And so usually like with the firstborn, it's like all of your anxieties go into that person. And then like your secondborn gets you when you're a little more chill. But with my daughter, at a certain point, I said, you know what, I, I feel like pushing her in this way, but that's not what she wants. That's not where she is. She's becoming her own person. And this is coming from my own stuff, my own background. So let her be. And I think that was ultimately better for her, because for me, academic achievement was such a strong part of my identity in a way that wasn't always helpful. It's those, in kind of humanistic psychology, when we talk about conditions of worth, that we are valuable if we meet certain conditions or achieve certain standards of what it means to be a worthwhile person. And so I wasn't going to impose that on her. I wanted her to feel unconditionally loved no matter what. And so for her, yeah, she's motivated to do well because she wants to get good grades and, move on. But it's not such a strong part of her identity that if she doesn't, that it will mean that she's not valuable. And that, again, that's a micro victory to break those intergenerational cycles.
Yeah, because it can leave a child really vulnerable, right? Like if they're, let's say, they may be a natural artist, natural. It may not be so much of an academic, but academia is a part of that cultural value. You gotta, go all the way and get this kind of job and achieve this, right? And if they don't really kind of pair up with that, then where does that leave their self-esteem, their, like capacity to feel, like you mentioned, like a sense of self-worth? I can appreciate you bringing that in.
I mean, and I tried all of my hopes and dreams. I'm like, I wish I'd been able to take piano lessons. I wanted to take dance lessons. And so I'm like, I'm going to give them piano lessons and dance lessons. And that's not what they want. I mean, but, I think it was a valuable thing. The arts are always valuable for kids, but I realized a completely different person. Like, and this is not her thing, and that's okay. And I'm not going to impose my kind of what were my hopes and dreams. Like, let me give you what I. So sometimes we, as parents, we want to give our kids so much of what we wish we'd had, without really taking stock of like, okay, what is it that they want? They're not us, and they're in a completely different circumstance, and they're growing up differently. And so kind of taking our own values and framework and imposing it onto them can sometimes keep us from really appreciating who they are, who they're becoming.
Mm. And what does it do for children for a parent to then not impose? Like, what is it that they have the freedom now to do? How is it that they might feel given that pressure is off?
Well, that their value isn't a function of some standard that we hold for them to achieve or to meet, that they are loved unconditionally, no matter who they are or what they choose to do. We may not always understand their choices. We may not always agree with what they do, but we're going to love them no matter what. And so that's what our job as parents is, to be there for our kids, to listen. We're still going to have our opinions. We're still going to have our feelings about stuff that they do, but we're going to still love them. We're going to be that home base for them. of love and really unconditional love
Yeah.
as much as possible.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm hearing you say something really, really important here that I want to highlight, which is there is a process that also the parent has to undergo that feels a little bit like grief. The what I didn't receive, all the things that my child would have been had I pushed them in this direction. There's a lot of grief in there that happens with a parent that they have to reconcile with. Like, how do parents deal with that process when they have to now parent differently and kind of not do that imposition of cultural values anymore?
I think it's okay to let go. It's a process of letting go. You acknowledge and recognize where that might come from because we were parented a certain way. And not that we were parented badly necessarily. It's just that it was a different set of circumstances that our parents were going through. And so they adapted to what their circumstances were. But really recognizing, okay, this was me. This is not, am I doing this for myself? Or am I doing this because this is what's best for them? And then letting go, being okay with letting go of those expectations that we had of ourselves. And in some way, that's liberating. That can be liberating, but also a struggle. Like, I find that in my own parenting, there are certain expectations and things I come in with, and you have to sometimes have to ask myself, okay, is this because of me or is this because of them? And then letting go and still grieving those things. I wanted to tell a story. My daughter was in middle school and transitioning into high school. And I was feeling some grief mourning over, I didn't feel like we were as close as we used to. And, maybe she didn't think I was cool, or I don't know. Maybe I wasn't as important to her daily life as I had felt when she was littler. Right, when your parents or mom and dad are but especially mom for us, was part of the so central. Always wanted to spend time with mom and things like that. And now she's wanting to do other things and maybe even having to do with expectations that I might have had for her as for who she might be. And I was sitting there listening to this, and I had this epiphany, just this light bulb moment where I thought, oh my gosh, I am using this old framework to understand who my daughter is, to interpret who she is. And this is why there's something that's not fitting here. It doesn't fit. The wineskin will burst, right? And it's keeping me from really appreciating who she's becoming and who she's evolving into and might be. And she's not, the little kid that I'm still trying to hold on to. She's becoming this new independent person, and by using that old framework to try to look at her and think about her, I'm missing out on this amazing, wonderful person that she is becoming. And that was very letting go of that. It's kind of like that letting go of the old expectations and the old way of thinking or who they were when they were growing up, and being curious about who she was becoming. That really, I think, transformed our relationship. It's not like it transformed our relationship because there was nothing wrong with our relationship, except in my mind. But it really transformed for me how I thought about our relationship.
I'm curious as to, I'll talk about, I'm going to go all the way back because I know we're talking about some of the big littles, as I call them, right? Like adolescence and as you mentioned, you do have a focus also on individuals that are emerging adults. But I think some of these transitions, they start as early as when they have to go into that first day of school or pre-K, or, even the transition from, the couple of months of leave after a child is born, and then you're transitioning into a different kind of relationship with your child. I know that parents will likely, there may be parents that are parents of adolescents, but they also have a 9-month-old, right? And so I'm curious as to whether or not there are similarities or differences in how parents experience transitions that early on versus, later when children are a little bit more grown up.
Well, I think when your kids are in school, it's a big difference. So I'm only speaking based on my own experience. But once they're in school, it's very different from when they're at home and it's just you are their world. Now their world is opening up to other people. They're becoming more independent and learning how to do things on their own, versus relying on us in the same way. But we're still learning to communicate with them. We're just because they're more verbal, rather than when you have a baby and the baby cries, you're figuring it out. I'm like, okay, why is this baby crying? Is the baby tired? Is the baby hungry? Does the baby need their diaper changed? Right? And so they are not able to tell you, do they want to just be held? And so as they get older, they start verbalizing their needs more, right? So when they can talk to us, when they can communicate with us, they can tell us. But sometimes, and as they're still learning to express themselves, sometimes kids may, they may cry when they're, or they may, become irritable or like start, they may be fighting with us or seem oppositional or start, maybe they're, I don't know, behaving in certain ways that we would frown upon, and we're still trying to figure out what's underneath that. So, my friend and colleague, Dr. Ana Peralta, calls it has this iceberg metaphor that I think we can use with kids of various ages, where there's the communication that's on the surface at the tip of the iceberg, but always underneath that communication, there might be something else. So if a kid is arguing with us and irritable, we might be reacting to, negatively reacting to that. Well, look, don't be disrespectful. Like I come from a family, as a Latina, come from a family where you respect your parents. You don't argue with your parents. You respect your parents. And so there is that kind of automatic response like, oh, why are they being disrespectful? Both my husband and I come from families where we're taught to respect our elders, taught to respect our parents. And so, why we might initially react to that based on our own kind of understanding of like what are kids, you're supposed to respect your parents. But maybe there's something underneath that communication. Maybe, a kid is being oppositional because maybe there's a sibling, there's a sibling in the house, and they are, they're jealous because they're getting a lot of attention that day, and they want to have your attention. Or maybe they're afraid of something that's about to happen, or maybe they're really sad, and then it's showing itself as something else on the surface. But as parents, we're always looking at what's underneath the surface. And I think that's true of many of our human communications, even with our peers, right? That sometimes one thing is being communicated on the surface, but underneath that, there might be other things that are going on.
Dr. Miranda, for a lot of kids, parents are their heroes, right? And that kind of puts parents in the position of always stepping in to save them. And the reality is that parents can't always save their children. I'm wondering, of course, parents can offer support, but what can help a parent not jump into trying to fix every problem that their kid has and really not, in essence, kind of like allowing them to figure things out sometimes and find solutions and get creative about things? Like, what can be helpful?
Yeah, a lot of the times our kids just want us to listen when they come to us with something. They don't necessarily want us to fix things for them. I think part of our job is to give them that support and be that home base so that they can try to figure things out on their own, right? Because they're going to learn to navigate things throughout their lives. They're going to be navigating a lot of different things that come their way. And so we can offer guidance, we can offer suggestions, but I think when our kids come to us with a problem, especially when it has to do with how they're feeling, rather than jumping to trying to fix things, because sometimes there are things we can't fix. We're not always going to be able to fix everything. We don't have control over everything that they might experience. So the first step is to really listen and be there and let them know that we will love them no matter what. And I want to give you an example I've talked a lot about my daughter, but I wanted to mention my son. I have a 15-year-old son. And, my daughter, one of the differences between my daughter and my son, my daughter is the type, like, if, she wants to talk to me about something, and let's say I'm doing something else, she'll come and say, excuse me, pay attention to me right now. I need to talk to you about something, and let me tell you about my day. And, and then she'll start, telling me about her day. My son is quieter. And he, likes to spend time in his room playing video games with his friends. And so it's kind of hard to get when I ask him, how was school today? And I, try to, ask in different ways. And he's like, it's fine. Or, not super, doesn't elaborate a lot on what's going on in school. But anyway, this weekend, I received some news about my father's health that was very sad. And I was like bawling, like just, like ugly crying, and, I called, my husband was out of town, and my daughter's in college now. And so it was just my son and I called my son down for dinner, and he just saw me. I don't know if he'd ever seen me ugly cry in that way. I mean, we shouldn't call it ugly cry, but you know what I mean. And I was a little bit, part of me was worried, because you try to shield your kids sometimes from those, I don't know, seeing you that way. That's the temptation. What I was taught in my family is like, okay, you kind of hold it together for your kids. But sometimes some things are so sad that you have to just let yourself feel what you're feeling. And it's okay to feel what you're feeling. And so, I kind of said, I'm sorry, I want to explain to you what's going on. And so I told him about what was happening with my dad, with his grandfather. And they didn't grow up with my dad as much a part of their lives. And so he saw me crying, and he stopped, and he came towards me, and he just embraced me in a big hug and held me. And that was exactly what I needed in that moment. And he's not a hugger. He's not, and when he was little, he was more affectionate. But as a teenager, he's not an necessarily affectionate kid. But there was something about that moment where it wasn't words. It wasn't in words. It wasn't fixing. And he just knew that what I needed in that moment was a hug. And he, I'm like, oh my gosh, that was like when you talk about, there was like the combination, like, oh, I'm sad because of what's happening with my dad. And then it's like micro victory. I'm like, oh, you stepped up, Diego, thank you. Like, wow, so, and I'm using that as an example, not of me as a parent being there for my kid, but, I think that some of that reflects seeing it modeled, right? That when someone is going through a hard time, it's okay for them to feel what they feel. You're not going to be able to fix it. You're not going to know what to do all the time. But what you can do is be there and give them a big hug. And so I think that's what the lesson that that I take from that as a parent, because sometimes like I don't know how to communicate with him, but I can go and give him a big hug, which I do. Like that's actually what I'll like go and like, I love you. Hey, how you, and I'm like, okay, I know we're not like completely, we don't have the same relationship that I have with my more talkative daughter, but I can give you a big hug and tell you that I love you and remind you of that. And you can give me a big hug when I need one and remind. I mean, you're not saying I love you, but, you're showing me that you love me. And so I think that's part of it, is just being present, but also listening unconditionally and non-judgmentally, even if we are in our minds being judgmental, even if we have thoughts and feelings about what they're telling us. with a spirit of curiosity, being curious. So instead of rushing to like think about, oh, like what you don't like about one thing or another, to really be curious about why they think what they think, what's making them feel the way that they're feeling, and that it's okay to not be okay all the time.
It's beautiful what you just referenced, because it's kind of a bit of a 360 moment, is it? Right? Like if your son learned that a hug from someone you love as they're listening to something that is hurting you deeply is effective, his mind is going to go to someone I love is hurting deeply. I know what to do. Hug. Right. And so it's a beautiful moment in which, he knew what to do because that's what he received. Yeah. He received the moments of listening. He received moments when an embrace was, offered to him. And then he knew what to do instinctively. That's beautiful. And I've heard you say this here and there, and I hear parents all the time say the same thing, and I see it in my own family, that sometimes, the kids that we have seen grown up almost feel like these foreigners, these strangers to us at times, right? Because they start evolving, and the ways in which they evolve really throw us off, and they develop personalities, and we don't feel like we recognize them anymore, and they're just different, right? I'm wondering, if you could offer us maybe like a thought or two about how to remain connected, even, with the children in our lives that we feel like maybe we don't recognize as much.
Well, I think it's okay not to recognize our kids all the time, because if they were always the same person, that means that they're not evolving and changing. So I think it's natural not to recognize your kid, and it's okay. And so let's be curious about who they are, and be open to them changing. But also there are times when we may not recognize our kids because they're going through a really tough time emotionally. And so if we see signs like, increasing social withdrawal, not wanting to do the things that they usually enjoy doing, that we know that they enjoy doing, if they are very sad or tearful or increasingly irritable, or if they're saying certain things that makes us think like maybe they feel like a burden to their families, or that they don't belong, that they would be better off if they were not around. Things like that might indicate that maybe they're going through something where they might need additional support. So I think there are moments when we don't recognize our kids, maybe because they're going through a tough time and we want to be attuned to that. Or there may be other times that we don't recognize our kids simply because they're changing and they're growing up and they're not the same person that they were when they were little. And but the important thing is to be that home base for them, be that person who's going to be there for them and listen and love them, give them a hug when they need it, and who will support them through those changes, through those transitions.
My mother actually has started saying something very recently in reference to my now 18-year-old nephew, whom she helped actually raise in a multi-generational home. In his school, he wrote, "I am thankful for my grandma because she gives me food after school." Like she was just so present. And I remember her saying, now seeing him as this evolutionized big person, right? She said, I was there, and in Spanish, she said, "Mi hijo me lo gocé," which means, I really enjoyed my child. Like I was there and I enjoyed him. I saw him grow up. I experienced him. I knew all his quirks. I got an opportunity to really get to know him, to listen, to sit with him. And it's a beautiful thing that she can now kind of in retrospect say, I did that. Like I was there. I was present. I sat down with him. I asked him about his day. And I think that that's a level of pride that any caregiver, right, because she's not the parent, but she's a caregiver, can experience when we show up and when we listen and when we offer that moment to our littles that are, waiting for us to be there and to really be mindful and attuned to their experiences.
Absolutely. It's hard to do though. So I know that it's easy to say, okay, let's be present for our kids, but realistically, as often working parents, we've got a lot of our own stressors, and it can be hard to find that time. I know I am, my kids and my husband have this, they think of like my laptop as my, appendage, an extra. So, we have family jokes about my laptop, right? And so I want to keep it real, and we can strive to have those moments, right? But oftentimes we let the realities of our daily living, our daily life, interfere. But yeah, it's important to really try to center back and have those moments where we can be present with our kids and tuned in to what they may be experiencing. But and give ourselves grace when we don't do that. So I wanted to keep that real because I don't want people to think, oh my gosh, she's such a great parent, and she spends all this time with her. So there are times when we let the real realities of life interfere. The nice thing is that there are always opportunities to redirect and to course correct. We'll make a lot of mistakes along the way, but no one's a perfect parent. And so I think we need to also give ourselves grace.
That's such a beautiful message. I'm so glad that you rerouted us in that way. And I feel like parents will find that to be so much more relatable than some perfectionistic, I've got it all together, I figured it all out type of persona, which is not at all what you've embodied today. But I think that is the reality of parenting, right? It's learning, it's messy, it's falling down and picking yourself back up, it's modeling and forgetting to model, it's all the things, right? It's beautiful that you referenced that. As Dr. Miranda shared, there are a number of resources in the soundedouttogether.org website that any parent or caregiver can find in order to navigate these tough terrains of parenting. Dr. Miranda, I want to thank you for your wisdom and for your light and for being such a wonderful guest today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
This was Listen In. Thanks for joining us. Sound It Out is a national campaign from the Ad Council and Pivotal. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend or with a loved one. For some tools and for support, visit soundedouttogether.org.